Record unemployment, the ANC can't pay salaries, and international relations on this week's special episode of The Free Marketeers. Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Chris here with another episode of The Free Marketeers, and I'm joined by a very special guest who after today will be with us every week because she's going to enjoy the episode so much and just come back all the time. We have Mukundi. She's an intern here with the Free Market Foundation joining us today in the office. Mukundi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, doing very well, thanks. As I mentioned, we've got unemployment to talk about and of course the ANC not being able to pay staff salaries, but NHI will be successful, EWC will be successful. Before we get into that, just tell us a bit about you, your background. At the moment you're studying, so you're trying to forge a path for yourself, as it were. How did you come across the FMF, and tell us a bit about you?
So I'm currently a law student at the University of Wits, and I came across the FMF because I was doing research last year, and I was just looking at random opinion pieces, and then I found the FMF, and then I just applied and was like, let's see where this goes, because I think what you guys do is really interesting, it's really impactful, and it has a lot of reach. So I just applied just to see if I could also contribute, and then here I am, an intern.
Nice. Yeah, hopefully the more we influence you, hopefully we can keep you around for many, many years to come. For those of you who are interested, you can find some of Mukundi's articles and letters on our website. As always, www.freemarketfoundation.com. To get into the news then and the major talking points from this week, South Africa, we're very good at rugby and other sports, and now we can also claim to be the best at unemployment. So according to Bloomberg, South Africa's unemployment rate is now the highest among the countries that Bloomberg monitors. The jobless rate rose to 34.4% in the second quarter of this year, up from 32.6%. The median of three economists' estimates in a Bloomberg survey was 33.2%. If you include the expanded definition of unemployment, which is people who are available for work but not looking for a job, that rose to 44.4% from 43.2% in the first quarter. We can break this down a bit, but just Mukundi, your sort of general impressions. This is something that you expected. Of course, we keep having more lockdowns. The pandemic is still going on, so that's a factor. We have government policies which I don't think favor job creation in general. But do you think this trend is just going to continue where we at some point reach, 70% unemployment, that kind of thing?
I do expect this to continue as it is. I think that considering the pandemic and how things have been handled, the lockdowns, the shutdowns, there's not really been much to allow businesses to really operate, and allowing, especially because small businesses are the largest employers of people in South Africa, there hasn't been much room and much support for them, and that this is honestly going to continue to rise, it's expected. And moving forward, even with other policies that the government is considering, it's not really beneficial to solving this issue. I guess you could point to the current NHI bill as it stands. A lot of doctors, surprisingly, even in a pandemic, are not employed, don't have really much job security, and are yet needed, but they don't have security in the health sector and the health and being able to contribute to the health sector as a whole. So I honestly expect this to rise within a matter of years. Maybe next year it might be up to 50%. Who knows?
And probably to me, the most concerning part of the unemployment stats is for young people, the youth unemployment rate. Mm-hmm. So according to Stats.SA, nearly 2/3 of those aged 15 to 24 are unemployed. So it's almost on, it's above now 67% for that age group. And then 42.9% of those aged 25 to 34 were unemployed. About 3.4 million people out of 10.2 million aged 15 to 24 are not in employment, education, or training. I mean, we are now seeing more arguments and momentum for something like a basic income grant. And I think for many people across the ideological spectrum, we don't want to see our fellow man suffering, as it were. We want to help and provide some kind of assistance. It's a very empathetic, I think, reaction. But surely just going down the route of grants and continued assistance, while it can help people who are very destitute, I don't think that should be the main policy focus. Surely you need like growth in and of itself. You need economic activity to get there. What do you think? Do you think it's an either or? Do you think you can have both?
I honestly believe that just take away the grant. In order for you to allow people to grow, to have opportunities, to have access to opportunities, you have to change the system.
Right.
So even if we began to introduce these grants, you have to look at the overall system. Is there support for young people to enter the job market? Is there support and is there support for these people to be able to access the necessary tools to lift themselves out of poverty and out of these horrible situations? Because I mean, as young people, when you graduate from high school, when you go to varsity, your dream is, oh, I have job security. All is fine. All is fine. But if there is no overall system that actually is created to benefit businesses, to benefit people entering the market, this grant is not really going to do much of a difference. It's not really going to solve any of the great systemic issues.
Right. Yeah, and I suppose as well as more of a meta point, we keep on thinking we can redistribute people into prosperity, but at some point that pie is going to shrink. I mean, I think there are ever fewer taxpayers in the country. People are immigrating across racial lines and income lines. People are wanting to leave the country for different reasons. I have a lot of admiration for people who try to stay, obviously, and try and build, but also one can understand why they have their reasons for leaving. I feel like we need to incentivize people to stay as much as possible. And part of that is just getting out of their way.
It's also like how I mentioned earlier on, how since the early 2000s, a lot of doctors have been leaving Africa.
Right.
And it's one of the greatest benefits, I guess, for the West is that they have access to trained. They've saved thousands of dollars training these doctors, and they're just coming over to them. So looking at that also, like the overall system doesn't really support people trying to enter the job market, doesn't really support that. It doesn't really allow people to just be and exist within the system. And it's shocking because we're in a pandemic and we're still losing doctors. Yeah.
I feel like just a policy point, we don't have to go down this rabbit hole, as it were. But I mean, a lot of people's focus is on healthcare, obviously, with NHI, expropriation without compensation, maybe prescribed assets, the nationalization of the Reserve Bank, the basic income grant. And I feel like maybe sometimes we lose sight of education and how bad the education system is in South Africa. So, I mean, to put you on the spot, as it were, and you can sort of, you can bat it off for a bit if you wanted to, but how do we implement the necessary kind of reforms in education? I even think now there should be a discussion about this focus of people have to go to university, have to get an honors degree, a master's degree, a PhD, like this life path where, what about vocational training? What about that sort of skill set? I mean, you're always going to need, and people are going to be passionate about and feel stimulated by going into vocational training, stuff like, I don't know, engineering, plumbing, electricians, that sort of stuff. I mean, I know that's a big sort of point and, how do you solve South Africa's education crisis? But what do you think of that discussion?
I think that discussion is really important in the sense that I think that whenever you look to like how success looks, how prosperity looks, it's very thinly defined by just higher education, tertiary education, instead of actually looking at what our society actually needs.
Right.
And instead of actually looking to what could actually benefit us as a greater whole and as a great society. And I think that because higher education in terms of tertiary education is the only way out, it sort of limits our ability to think beyond how can we actually help young people as a whole. And I think that this is what the Fees Must Fall movement also sometimes misses, is that how can we actually contribute to our society as a whole? How can we contribute much more than just getting like a basic 4-year degree, as somebody who's doing a 4-year degree? But thinking beyond that and thinking what skills, how can we basically encourage people to want to build our country? And I think that the fact that we don't really have we have vocational schools, but some of them aren't even well maintained. The curriculum is also not well maintained. It's very few and far between. I think that should also be a major focus in terms of ensuring that young people have access to the job market, young people have access to education and these essential skills for South Africa. And
the necessary point with having the required opportunities is you need businesses in the first place. You need investment, capital investment. And I know the president has often had these summits where he's promised investment, but to me, his wishes don't gel with government policies, which which discourage investment, I would say. It's all well and good telling young people, get your degree, go to your vocational school. When you come out, there will be opportunities. If the businesses of all sizes, it's not just corporates, but anything, and in the informal sector don't exist in the first place to create those opportunities, it's almost like a dead end. You're promising people things that are never going to be delivered.
That's true. And it's sort of like, it ends up wasting, I guess it wastes the time of people, because a lot of people are going into these spaces thinking that, oh my gosh, I'm going to be supported. Oh my goodness, I have access to this wonderful skill and this tool. But if you can't use it anyway, what does that mean?
Yeah.
And that's where like the poverty trap also begins to emerge.
And we saw in July the spate of violence and looting, and not to quote unquote find reasons to justify it, but you can almost understand where for years people are promised things. They're promised jobs, houses, whatever, their wildest wishes. They're told, just keep voting for this government and you'll get it. And then when they reach a frustration point, we should try and understand why that happens. I know there is an argument that some of it was the result of instigators on behalf of the previous president. But I think there's an element and a lot of bubbling frustration in South Africa, and people are promised things, but the policy environment isn't right for that.
As bad as like the pandemic has been, I think that it's also been a point where a lot of the issues that have already existed have just become increasingly heightened, and that the week of riots is not an incident in isolation.
Right.
It's basically just been people's frustrations. The system has been cracking this whole year of 2020, 2021, and that people have it's just a physical manifestation of that frustration. And I think that the only way that we can really solve it is by changing the system, reforming the system.
Yeah. Moving on to our next point from the unemployment. We can always come back to that if we want to elucidate any more points. But just our major other topic of discussion for today is that the African National Congress staff were set to down tools from yesterday because of unpaid salaries. So, of course, we're recording on 27 August, which is a Friday. So ANC employees across the country say they will down tools. They are demanding their outstanding wages, and the party has been battling to reimburse its workers under time. So my question is, and maybe this is an unfair question because it's two separate things, but on the one hand, we have the party in government, the majority, who say we want to implement stuff like the national health insurance expropriation without compensation, and these things will work. We will deliver improved healthcare for all. We will give everyone land. On the one hand, on the other hand, they can't pay their staff their salaries. Is that a fair question? And also just give us your thoughts on the fact that they can't pay salaries.
I think that, I guess it would be two separate questions. I think that the fact that they can't pay their salaries also begins to show that, I guess, the envisioned reality or the hopes and dreams of what could be is also failing. Like, it's a manifestation of that. The ANC being unable to fulfill, like, pay salaries is already like a physical manifestation of that. And I think that the proposal to introduce EWC and the national health insurance, it's just putting a Band-Aid on these issues. It's not really addressing the deeper things. So even if we were to like introduce the NHI, we have to think back and look. We need doctors to power that. Yeah. Isn't the Charlotte hospital not open?
One. I'm speaking under correction, and the listeners can correct both of us. But I think one or two of the divisions of the hospital are open again. But even they're diverting people to go to other hospitals.
You see,
and this is supposed to be one of Joburg's biggest hospitals.
And it's supposed to like service, like, how many people live in Joburg? Like over like 5 million people. Yeah. So it doesn't make sense. So I feel that these are a wonderful idea. They are ideas, wonderful ideas. Having good healthcare is like a wonderful idea. Everyone deserves that. But at the same time, we don't even have the manpower to actually like run these things. We don't have we have a lot more broader issues. Firstly, to have those doctors need education, and feeds back into our initial argument. And now we have to like power this. We need to ensure that there's good health, there's good tools to use there, like good products, like tools, surgicals, whatever. It doesn't speak to the reality of the situation. And I think that we really need to come back to earth and really look at where we are and begin to understand what can we solve now? What needs direct attention right now?
I do feel bad for, of course, employees and workers of the ANC.
Of course.
I mean, they said management have made numerous verbal and written undertakings to address some of their demands by the end of August. They called on the party's political leaders urgently intervene. I believe President Ramaphosa is in Germany this week, so he's
Living
gone
life.
out asking for more money to invest in South Africa. I mean, I don't know if he's going to wade into this debate, but it's a sad indictment of the party, and you wonder. I mean, you wonder when the reality is really going to make them change their mind about a lot of their plans. As you say, actually being realistic about one's ideals and the bullet trains and the smart cities that you want to build, but how do you get there and the work that's needed? And it's not shortcuts. I mean, if you actually want improved healthcare for all, you need to implement the reforms that reform both the public and private health sectors. If you want people to have property, you give title deeds, you do that kind of thing. You don't just take these shortcuts and say, oh, let's just amend the constitution, it's going to fix everything. Down that path, I think, leads even more of this kind of problem.
And I guess like a separate aspect that we could really pinpoint to like really drive this home is like the fourth industrial revolution. It is wonderful. It's wonderful trying to get people into like an industrialized world where everything's running efficiently. But I think that within the African context, more so like within South Africa, there's this glamorization that we're going to have these amazing fast trains. You're going to have wonderful like Wi-Fi all around. But we need to also look, quite honestly, those are wonderful aspirations, but we also need to look at our reality and say, okay, can we achieve this? What do we need now to actually like provide the basic needs for what people need now? Just driving that home first, and then we can move towards these things at an aspirational, like at sort of that pace.
I agree. Moving on to another topic, and we can get onto the international, I think, aspects as well, because there's always a lot happening in the world. But I just wanted to mention for those of you, this is sort of a public service announcement, as it were. If you've been struggling to renew your driver's license, Minister Fikile Mbalula has extended the grace period until the end of March 2022. So for those of you who are struggling to renew your licenses, especially in Gauteng, there's been a lot of issues with the booking system, and obviously licensing centers are in serious trouble. But now, for those of you who are stressing, you should still stress, because it's not that they're going to fix everything before next year, March. But at least now the grace period has been extended. Apparently, Gauteng has the highest number of experienced licenses in the country. So good job, all of you who are listening in Gauteng. So just a little announcement on that. I don't know if you have any ideas on how we can solve the licensing issue.
No, that's heavy. Okay. But wasn't it extended like last year till June? So it just keeps on being extended.
Because there was a lot of, I think, angst now because it's 27 August and this deadline was 31 August. So people were, and people can't get booking slots. They can't even like go in the first place.
Yeah.
So now they've extended it again until next year. Maybe we should take a bet on what will we have first? Will we have an actual deadline the end of March next year? Or will the local government elections take place before?
That's also like stressful. Like, will we even have, because it hasn't been publicized, no ad, nothing. It's just like sort of in limbo.
Yeah.
What do you think about that? Like, do you think that, what would be like a hypothetical situation of like the elections not occurring? What does that mean for South Africa long term?
I think it's a very dangerous precedent. And I know that the justification for the IEC, for example, or people in government will be the pandemic and how difficult it is. But I mean, on the other hand, you can say people are queuing in lines, people are going to shops. The pandemic is still, COVID is going to be with us probably forever. But democracy, as it were, needs to happen. It needs to take place. So I think it sets a dangerous precedent. It will then set the precedent that elections can be postponed for other reasons in the future. I think there's a lot of pressure on government at the moment, especially after the last 2 years. I mean, never mind the economic issues before COVID and during COVID, but we even saw wide-scale PPE looting during the pandemic. So I think there is a bit of momentum against government now, as it were. Maybe that's me being too hopeful and hoping that people will vote differently. But I just think it's a dangerous precedent, and that the local elections should still take place. They should take place in October. They should happen this year, I'm hoping. I don't think we should delay them. What do you think?
I think adding on to the dangerous precedent, just looking at how this pandemic has been handled, there's not been good governance.
Right.
There haven't been any like checks and balances. Whenever people have been seeking out like accountability, it's always they have to pursue the courts. You have to go to the courts instead of actual government being open and honest.
Imagine. Yeah, you wrote an article on the National Coronavirus Command Council.
Yeah, and
2 months ago.
Yeah, so there hasn't been much openness. There hasn't been much transparency, and I feel that, not to be nihilistic or anything, but there is a possibility that we might not have elections, or it might be postponed, just as how like a lot of these shutdowns have been justified despite there not being any like accountability, nobody really answering in parliament, to how this pandemic has been governed, who's deciding, who's making these decisions. And nothing like that has been released. So I'm a contrarian, but I do believe that this election might be postponed. I do believe, given how the pandemic has been handled, given how there hasn't been much transparency, we need good governance, it is highly likely.
Okay, so we won't have you back on the podcast because you're just going to give us the bad news as possible.
I'm being realistic.
The kind of work that we do, we have to be in touch with everything going on, and we have to make sort of calls and, formulate our thoughts in terms of how, sort of, what's the worst case scenario, as it were.
But I guess I'm just reading the room.
No, fair enough. Reading the tea leaves.
Yes.
Moving on to our final topic of conversation, we thought we'd touch on some international matters. Obviously, the last 2 weeks, the news has been dominated by the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, and the mess that has been. I mean, from a libertarian point of view, one doesn't want non-ending war occupation to go on forever. So I think a withdrawal is always coming. We're not military experts. I'm not going to try and say here, like they should have done this step or that step or whatever. But I think we can all say, regardless of our ideological sort of inclination, it's been a mess.
Yeah, they botched it.
Yes, yeah, very badly. So yesterday, I believe there was an explosion at Kabul airport.
And despite the US having, that's the only area that they can have control over.
Right. And you hear some US representatives, for example, saying publicly to the Taliban, the international community will be watching you with interest and pressure and whatever. And I just think the Taliban's like, okay,
so
like cool story. So that was the one international point. So if you want to, you can obviously talk to that and anything else internationally that you want to tell the listeners about.
I think that the whole the Afghan conflict, it has been widely known, like since 2017, earlier than that they would not be able to pull out successfully with keeping a democratic government in place. I think that the promises by the Taliban to be progressive, to protect the rights of women, to ensure that everything is done by the book, is quite unrealistic, despite considering the fact that they took Afghanistan by a coup, right. Like having to trust somebody and letting them tell you that, yeah, sure thing, we'll make sure that there's rule of law, despite they being a coup. That doesn't really provide much confidence. I think that I guess more of an unpopular opinion that has emerged is whether this is a sort of a turning point for the US and the US politics and how they engage with the rest of the world. What position can they take and what position should they take? And one thing that comes up is sort of using China as a foil to the USA and how China handles their dealings internationally and how they work with governments. Could this also indicate the USA having to change and pivot their international strategy? Could they take on more of in order to stay in line with the needs of the world and also how the world is evolving, would they have to take on a standpoint of just being we respect sovereignty and we're just here to push our own agenda, similar to China? I don't know. What do you think?
I think China, they're moving in Afghanistan.
They are.
And it's very close to China, obviously. So they want to make sure that the regions that surround them are relatively stable. For all the foils that the US has, and I think we should acknowledge them, we should also, I think there's an element to be said of the last 100 years-ish, maybe a little bit less, of relative. I mean, the pockets of violence and stuff, but compared to the rest of human history, the relative level of peace and stability that there has been. Now, does that mean that the US should forever be the world's policeman? You would hope not, and you would hope that people all around the world start, looking, quote unquote, after their own backyards, as it were. My main concern, and I think a point of interest that comes out from this specific example is, do liberal institutions work around the world? And should, for example, a country like the US, the UK, Germany, France, should they try and do this whole nation building, exporting democracy thing? Or should you, where do you draw the line? Do you want to put international sanctions on countries to reform like North Korea or whatever?
It doesn't work.
Yes. Does it actually work? Or does it just encourage more autocratic behavior and totalitarian behavior in the long run? It's very difficult to say, and I'm sure there's strong arguments and points on either side. But one just wishes that things don't destabilize and descend as they might have been 100 years ago.
I get that's true, but I'm also just curious. Like even within like the period of like the last 100 years, there's always been conflict. There's been proxies that have been used to facilitate like that frustration into like Vietnam, Korea, Afghanistan's just like one of the newest examples to just a recent one, I guess. But what I want to ask is more so, what policy? I mean, not policy experts here, but what policy do you think that the US could take now, or should take now, given the failure of Afghanistan? How should they approach the rest of the world? And also balancing something such as responsibility to protect that like was adopted in 2005. How do you balance that?
At the very least, I think in terms of policy, and we can comment on stuff that affects liberty in a policy sense. So at the very least, they should now repeal the Patriot Act, because that was introduced for the Afghanistan war. So now, should you still infringe on Americans and people around the world civil liberties and invade their privacy? I think that's one policy point that should be taken. It's not going to be, because as we've seen throughout history, governments virtually never let go of the power that they accrue in emergencies and through war. They always keep on to that power, and they want to build more of it. From an international relations point of view, I hope that the US stands by its allies, because I think there is something to be said for allyship and showing your allies that you've got their back. I think about a country like Taiwan, which is going to be coming under more pressure with the whole semiconductor war. After
Hong Kong was just like essentially seized.
Right. And even you can say with Hong Kong, did the US do enough? That they sort of did they say, oh, well, all Hong Kongers who want to come to the US come in? I know the UK allow
and Canada
some people in, but I'm worried about the sort of allyship point. And in general, I'm worried about the rise of populism around the world and sort of strong men. I think there's a hunger for that in many populations around the world, not just in certain countries. And I'm worried about how that's going to rise.
No, you just raised like a really interesting point about Hong Kong, and how like America, nobody really did much. It was just like, Hong Kong's be taken over. Oops. Yeah, oh well. Good luck, yeah, good luck. Yeah. So how could we have handled that better? How could we have handled that situation better? Because people from Hong Kong were literally crying out, saying, "Please!" Like they're about to take over our system of governance.
You need to, and this is more of a psychological point maybe, but you need red lines, and you need to stick to those red lines. Then you can't just say, don't do this, and then when the country does it, you're like, let's move the red line again. No,
the goalpost keeps moving.
There we go. Former US President Barack Obama had his line in the sand with Syria, but that line in the sand kept on moving. And you're like, is it really a line, or is it just a sort of pragmatic point, as it were? This isn't to say that you can't have different forms of power and negotiation. You can have hard power, soft power. You can have negotiation behind the scenes. You can have force of military shows of military force. So the US could roll out aircraft carriers now in the Gulf and other places in the Middle East. Is that going to achieve the same ends that they ultimately want? And you also, we shouldn't hold up any country, I think, as like the moral paragon of the world, because
the moral police,
that again gives justification for all sorts of infractions, because they can say, oh, well, we're just protecting people kind of thing. What is that? There's always a meme been going around that's like, what, you will follow our ways by force, or something like that. You will adopt democracy by force. Yeah. Does it actually then count as does it hold if people don't implement those systems and institutions themselves?
And also I guess, should you force it? Like if it's an area and a system, and they have their own systems that work in that area, is it just to also impose your way of life? Is it equitable? Is it actually meaningful? Does it actually speak to the reality and the philosophies behind libertarianism?
Yeah, I think you get a school of thought in libertarianism which says anywhere where liberty is infringed, you need to fight against the oppressors. So who does that burden then fall onto? Exactly. Ultimately, someone needs to then pick up their rifle and go and fight it. Now, does it fall on the American citizen who's 18 years old, just out of college, kind of thing, who has to go overseas and do it? I like that many people tend towards liberty, but I don't know if there's this is me, as an objectivist speaking, but I don't know if there's a moral obligation on you to go and do X and sacrifice your life in that way. And it's not, it's not an easy, is it a utilitarian point? Do you say if we sacrifice 10 American lives, we save 100,000 Afghanistan lives?
I guess I think another thing sort of like detracting from that is who gets to save those lives. So the USA, they were sort of, because they have like a hegemonic power, hegemonic force, they get to do that. But could a country such as, I don't know, a random country, maybe Algeria, decide, we're going to go send troops? Would they experience the same sort of the ability to just go in and do whatever you want to do in the name of democracy? It's also, those things also happen within the world system of who gets to decide, who gets to enforce liberty, who gets to enforce what is right, and who decides who is right. You see, one of those things also emerge. The US was viewed as like, wow, well done, an upstanding state starting this war. But now look at it 20 years later.
Yeah, maybe we're missing the crucial point, which is that if anyone goes into Afghanistan, they all mess up. You mentioned earlier it was the Brits, first the Soviets.
Yeah, it was Britain in the 1834 something.
Okay, then the Soviets.
Yeah, in the 70s.
I mean, the Soviet Union collapsed partly because of like doing that invasion and the financial costs. Yeah. And is this the steady decline of the US empire?
And also, like the Gorbachev was trying to sort of reform the system, trying to reform the USSR, thinking, let's just try and like model our state after something that would be beneficial. And then thereafter, what happens.
We can obviously go on for hours about different philosophies, ideologies, and like international relations, but I think that's a good note on which to end. We've covered quite a bit this week, from local to international. We have to thank you for coming on this week, Mukundi. I've greatly enjoyed getting to talk to you, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really fun. Nice banter.
yeah, I think it's been good. To the listeners, thank you as always for joining us for yet another episode. We greatly appreciate all of the support that you give us. If you enjoyed this episode, please like the video. Please also subscribe to our YouTube channel if you haven't yet. And if you're listening on any other podcast platform in audio format, obviously, please subscribe to our feed so that you get all of our new episodes as they come out. Next week, I should have 2 episodes coming, one with Mark Oppenheimer on the Kwalani judgment, and then another episode with Hendru Krier of Solidarity, the trade union, about their recent NHI research, which included stats like how many doctors and nurses are saying they will leave the country if the NHI is implemented. So make sure you subscribe to our channel so you see all those episodes when they come out. Until next time, have a good weekend. Take care out there, stay safe, and we'll talk to you all again very soon. Bye-bye.